Today I'm going to present to you a brief overview of the history of anarchism in Australia. It is important to note that this video does not cover all forms of anarchism in Australia. It merely runs through some of the major events concerning Australian anarchists and the ideas discussed by these prominent individuals. All sources of information will be linked under the video. The 1871 Paris Commune. It is important to recognize the effect of the 1871 Paris Commune as a developer of emergent anarchist thought, not only in Australia, but around the world. Whilst the Paris Commune itself was not anarchist, many influential anarchist intellectuals, such as Kropotkin, drew strong conclusions from analyzing the Paris Commune. Anarchist symbology, such as the use of black flags, was also derived from the Paris Commune. Anarchism's emergence on the Australian scene. Criticisms of anarchists and anarchism can be found in newspapers as early as the 1840s in Australia. It was often used by those with conservative views to discredit or slander people who were seen as rebellious, and was used as a descriptor during times of social crisis. The example on your screen is from an 1849 edition of the Argus newspaper in Melbourne, where a clear contrast is displayed between the intelligent and industrious artisan and the wild throb of the rebel and the anarchist. The emergence of anarchist groups in Australia ties in strongly with the turbulent decades of the 1880s and 1890s, where many views about the potential for an Australian nation were formed. Many workers' groups in Australia contain individuals, and it was a home for those who identified with anarchist philosophies. One such example is the Workingmen's Political Reform Association, where half of its members would become anarchists. A significant home for a future Australian anarchist organisation was the Victorian branch of the Australasian Secular Organisation. A rupture between the leader of the ASA, Joseph Symes, and anarchists led to the formation of Australia's first anarchist organisation, the Melbourne Anarchist Club. The Melbourne Anarchist Club was founded in May of 1886. Its leading members included people such as David Andrade, Fred Upham, and Chummy Fleming. The Melbourne Anarchist Club hosted a wide array of anarchists ranging from those known in modern terms as anarcho-capitalists to those who were more aligned to collectivist forms of anarchism. Author Bob James describes leading member David Andrade as an anarcho-capitalist due to his belief in the assertion that the right to private property must be guaranteed in an anarchist society. He saw an inextricable link between anarchy and atheism, which is evidenced in one of his speeches to the club, where he proclaimed, "Atheism says, defy the priest who robs you under the authority of a god. Anarchy says, defy the ruler who robs you under the authority of a state as well. Atheism says, be free in your thoughts. Anarchy says, be free in your thoughts and actions too. Atheism says, face the gods like a man. Anarchy says, face all existence like a man. Atheism says, from the gods be free. Anarchy simply says, be free." A split occurred in the club in 1888 where a divide was present between anarcho-communists, led by Jack Andrews, and Tucker and Andrade's anarcho-capitalist vision. This effectively ended frequent meetings, and the club only held sporadic meetings until 1896, where it ceased operations. Andrews' move to Sydney saw anarcho-communist trains of thought being more prevalent in New South Wales and individualist styles of anarchism being more common in Melbourne in the late 19th century. Anarchist principles and ideas were not confined to indoor debates in the late 19th and early 20th century. During these times, anarchists mixed in with unions and were involved in grassroots activism. Jack Andrews, Robert Beattie, and several other important anarchist thinkers were part of a loosely organised propaganda network based out of Smithfield in Sydney. They disseminated thousands of handbills, newsletters, books, pamphlets, and seeded numerous groups that were in opposition to the prevailing regime. One of the groups they seeded, the Active Service Brigade, became a strong part of the development of the Australian Labor Party, one of Australia's prominent political parties after Federation. An example of a placard that was created by the group is displayed on your screen. Several direct action initiatives also occurred. One notable example being Larry Petrie's bombing of the SS Aramac in 1893 due to his low regard for non-unionist scab labour. I'm also going to mention William Lane's vision for a new Australia colony. Lane's libertarian communist, or perhaps utopian socialist vision, which consisted of using the ideals of mateship and cooperation with a focus on voluntarism, led him to organise a campaign for a new Australia colony based in Paraguay. He successfully organised the movement of over 200 people to the colony in Paraguay. The 6 principles displayed on your screen were the inviolable principles of the new Australia colony. His vision was short-lived as the colony did not succeed, but is a notable example of an attempt to implement a form of anarchism on a relatively large scale. Anarchism during World War I. Several prominent anarchist thinkers in Australia were involved in the Australian branch of Industrial Workers of the World. Members of the IWW were colloquially known as the Wobblies and were a strong part of the union movement during World War I. The IWW notably set up workers' councils in the meat industries in South Australia, Victoria and Queensland in the early 1900s. A notable anarchist involved in the IWW during World War I was Monty Miller. At the ripe old age of 86, he was still fervently involved in anti-conscription campaigns of World War I and was arrested because of his campaigning. Anarchism post-World War I. Anarchist traditions in Australia were kept alive amongst multiple different groups of people. William Andrade, brother of prominent Melbourne Anarchist Club member David Andrade, had several bookstores in Melbourne and Sydney that sold anarchist literature. His bookshops also served as a meeting place for various radical left-wing groups in Australia. There was also a notable anarchist presence among Italian immigrants to Australia during the interwar period. One notable group that formed in Sydney was Lega Antifascista in 1926, of which most of its 300 members held anarchist views. Another significant anarchist group was founded by Francesco Carmagnola in North Queensland in 1932. He worked in the cane fields, and he and his fellow anarchist sympathisers frequently campaigned for anarchist rights throughout the 1930s. The Sydney Push developed as an intellectual subculture in the 1940s and mainly operated in Sydney's pubs. It was composed of university students, academics, manual labourers, lawyers, public servants, journalists, and even criminals. Common theme among these people was their rejection of conventional morality and disdain for any form of authoritarianism. They commonly met at the Royal George Hotel, which has since been renamed the Slip Inn. Some notable figures that were part of the Sydney Push include Germaine Greer, Richard Appleton, Lex Banning, and Paddy McGuinness. The Sydney Push adopted an attitude of permanent protest, and they were also heavily involved in demonstrations against apartheid in South Africa and also supported victims of the 1960 Sharpeville massacre. The Sydney Push ran up until the 1970s. Anarchism post-World War II. Spanish, Italian and Bulgarian migrants post-World War II also contributed to the spread of anarchist thought in Australia. Many Spaniards involved in anarchist movements of the 1930s sought political asylum in Australia, often enduring difficult situations in refugee camps before arriving in Australia. The Italian and Spanish anarchist groups were primarily based in Melbourne and Sydney in the 1960s and 1970s, with the small Bulgarian groups being based in Sydney and Wollongong. Australia's first anarchist bookshop, Jura Books, opened in 1997 and its present site in Petersham is still open to this day. The 1986 Australian Anarchist Centenary celebrations occurred to mark the opening of Australia's first anarchist organisation, the Melbourne Anarchist Club. Around 400 people attended the May Day March, which included visitors from all around the world. Contemporary anarchism. Other important moments in anarchist history of Australia include the 1986 foundation of the Anarcho-Syndicalist Federation, the formation of Mutiny Collective in 2003, and also the unfortunate closure of the Melbourne Anarchist Clubhouse in 2019. Thank you for listening to this overview of anarchism. There's a lot of information out there for you to explore if you wish to learn more about